Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Be Like Christ for our 5-minute Bible study today through Exodus 23. If you want the free PDF, you can download it. There's a link down in the description. When did the events of Exodus 23 happen? Well, God delivered the Israelites from slavery in Egypt in about 1491 BC. And the events of this chapter happened approximately 3 months after the children of Israel left Egypt, that according to Exodus 19, verse 1. In terms of our main characters in this chapter, they're the same as last chapter. We've got God and Moses. So God had descended onto Mount Sinai back in chapter, I think that was 19. Now, here in Exodus 23, God is communicating his laws, his rules to Moses, who is then going to deliver them to the people of Israel. And these laws are going to govern them in civic matters and religious matters. And then for our map, once again, it's pretty simple. This conversation between God and Moses happened on Mount Sinai, and you can see the traditional location of Mount Sinai, where many people think it was located on the map on the PDF. If you were with us for our last chapter, chapter 22, you'll know that that chapter was a list of different laws and commands that God wanted his people to follow, and they dealt with all kinds of things like animal liability and the rights of masters and slaves. Well, again, in this chapter, we're going to have a series of commands that God is giving to his people and the way that he wants them to live. So in the first section, verses 1 through 9, we're going to talk about some laws that deal with upholding justice and loving enemies. The Israelites were not to corrupt the legal system by giving false testimonies, by taking bribes, taking advantage of poor people, or siding with a particular party in a judicial case based on their personal preferences or some advantage that they could get out of it. They were instructed to help their enemies if they discovered that they had some kind of a need. The text says, quote, "If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. And if you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall rescue it with him." So a lot of people think that the loving your enemies idea is just a New Testament concept that Jesus introduced, but here God is introducing it 1,500 years before Jesus came down and walked on the earth. All right, then moving on to our second section, we have some laws regarding periods of Sabbath and sacred feast days. This is verses 10 through 19. The Hebrews were to plant and to harvest their fields, their olive groves, their vineyards for 6 years, but on the 7th year they were supposed to let them rest and not plant and not harvest. Likewise, they were supposed to work 6 days out of the week, but then they were supposed to take the 7th day and rest because that was a holy Sabbath day to the Lord. They were not to worship any foreign gods or any foreign idols, only the God who had delivered them from Egyptian slavery. 3 feast days were supposed to be kept by all of the Jews annually. There was the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which we've talked about at some length already. There was the Feast of Harvest, which was at the beginning of the harvest. And then there was the Feast of Ingathering, which took place at the end of the harvest. All of the men of Israel were supposed to appear before the Lord to offer sacrifices on these 3 days. That is according to Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 16. And then in our final section, verses 20 through 33, God promises to guide Israel and to give them the promised land. So God was going to send an angel or a messenger ahead of the Israelites to guard them and to lead them into the Canaan land, which was the promised land. They were to obey everything that he told them to do. And when they arrived in Canaan, God promised to gradually cast out the pagan inhabitants that lived there and then to give the Hebrews that land. If Israel would faithfully obey God, then he would be their strength. He told them that he would defeat their enemies, he would give them abundant food, he would take away the diseases that afflicted other nations, he would even cure their barren women and make them fruitful. The Israelites were told, though, not to assimilate with the Canaanites. They were not to worship their gods. They were not to marry their women, lest they become, quote, a snare. And we'll see how well Israel does at following that command as we go through the rest of the Old Testament. And so finally now for our application. The fulfillment of some of God's promises, like the ones that we just mentioned, were dependent on the obedience of his people. He said, "If you follow me, then I will do these things for you." You'll see these kind of conditional promises all throughout the Old Testament, and you'll see them also in the New Testament scriptures. They're replete with calls for obedience. As with the Israelites, both in their salvation from Egypt and in their conquest of the land of Canaan, it was God who provided the power. He was the one who brought all of those things about. However, his people were still expected to be obedient. And similarly, in the modern day, God's power provides us with salvation and the hope of one day entering our promised land, which is heaven. But although it is God's power, he still expects his people, the disciples of Jesus, to be obedient and to obey his commands. Anyone who tells you that you can trust in God's salvation while largely ignoring what he's told us, his instructions, what we find in his word, isn't presenting the message of salvation accurately and isn't presenting God accurately.